This video is about what to do when you are trying to name a compound that's not binary. So I have an example that I start you off with, and then several different possible avenues to get to the answer. This example is Na2SO4. It's 3 elements, so it's not binary. So I suggest the first thing you do is ask, is there a metal here? In this case, sodium is, yes, a metal. So we can tell then this is probably an ionic compound, and since there are 3 elements, then the second half is probably a polyatomic ion, and we'll get to what that means in a minute. If the second part of this, if there is no metal, then you could ask, is the first part ammonium, which is NH4? If it is, then this again is ionic, and the second half may be polyatomic, or it could be just monatomic, which is what the type of ions we've already been dealing with, simple single element ions. If the first part is not ammonium, then this is probably some complex organic compound that you really don't need to know about right now, and it's purely a covalent compound. So in the case that you find that this is going to be an ionic compound because the first part of it is a metal or the first part of it is ammonium, then here's some rules that we're going to follow for naming. First of all, you're going to either name the first half with the metal element name, such as sodium in this case, or you're going to name it with the polyatomic positively charged ion name, and the only one I'm going to ask you to know is ammonium. For the second part of the name, you're either going to name the second half with the usual IDE non-metal name, such as chloride or oxide, or you're going to name it with the polyatomic negative ion name, and in this case, we are going to have to find out what that is. So, here are 9 polyatomic ions you need to memorize for my class. Polyatomic then means multiple, and then the atomic part is actually referring to elements. So this is a multiple element ion, a charged thing that's made of multiple elements all at the same time. And these are basically covalent compounds that behave like simple ions such as sodium and chloride, but they are multiple element ions all at the same time. There are 9. Here are the ones you need to know for this class. There's only one that's positively charged, and it has a positive 1 charge. Its formula is NH4 with a positive 1 charge, and it's called ammonium, not ammonia, which is something different. The next 5 are -1 charges, and the first one is C2H3O2 with a -1 charge. It's called acetate or acetate ion. It's sometimes written as CH3COO. The next one is called cyanide. You probably heard of that before. It has a -1 charge. The next one is ClO3. It is also a -1 charge. It's called chlorate, not chloride. OH with a -1 charge is called hydroxide. You may have heard of that before. NO3 with a -1 charge is called nitrate. You've probably heard of that before. And then we get to ones that have a -2 charge. CO3 with a -2 charge is called carbonate, and SO4 with a -2 charge is called sulfate. And then we have one that you have to know that's got a -3 charge, and that's PO4, and that's phosphate. So those are the ones you have to know for this class. You'll have to memorize them. You need to recognize them when you see them. So some examples of this. The example we started off with was Na2SO4. So we look at it and we say, okay, that first part is a metal. I recognize that as sodium. So we just give it its normal name from the periodic table, just like we would if it was a regular ionic compound. The second part we look at by itself and we say, do I recognize that as anything? And you should recognize that as sulfate. So the full name of this is sodium sulfate. Pretty simple. Let's look at the next one. You look at that first part and you say, do I recognize this as a metal? No, you don't. Nitrogen is not a metal, but NH4 is ammonium. So you give the first part the name ammonium. And then you look at the second part and you say, do I recognize that as anything? Cl. Oh yes, that's chlorine from the periodic table. It's by itself, so I just call it chloride. You always change the second part to IDE ending if it's just a simple single element. Okay, what about the next one? Do I recognize, oh, look at there's parentheses and NH4 inside the parentheses. That tells me right there that that is ammonium, and it makes it easy to see because of the parentheses. The parentheses and the 3 after the parentheses just means that the ammonium had to be in the formula 3 times in order to make the neutral compound. PO4 is something I recognize from my list that I memorized as phosphate. So the name of this is ammonium phosphate. This next one is kind of complicated. C6H12O6 is nothing I recognize. The first part's not a metal. There's nothing in here that I recognize as a particular ion from my list. So I would have to know then that that's some sort of sugar, perhaps glucose. And that's one of those complex organic compounds that's purely covalent. The last part, CrNO3, and the NO3 is inside parentheses with a 3 behind it. That tells me that this is some sort of ion, and I do recognize Cr as one of my metals from the periodic table, and it's one of my special metals that can have multiple charge. So I have to figure out what the charge of the chromium is in this case. I recognize NO3 as nitrate. I'll need to remember that nitrate has a -1 charge all by itself. 3 of them means that this total negative side of this ionic compound is -3, and then the chromium is going to have to match that charge. Since there's only 1 chromium in the formula, it's going to match the 3 charge of the nitrate with a +3 charge of its own. So we're going to call that chromium 3 nitrate. Hope this helps. So some examples.